Maybe I'll tell people about Aurora Lee.
Oh yeah, please.
I just had to like put the book down this morning. I was just gasping about,
Wow.
wow, that was so amazing.
And I hadn't heard of it until.
Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one who never heard of this
No.
before.
Mm-mm.
But it confirms, it kind of confirms his point that people are afraid of poetry.
Mm-hmm. Because it's just been lost.
Mhm.
It also helps to validate him as an authority. If these things are actually as good as he says.
Yep.
Sorry, I missed what you guys are talking about.
Oh, I know, because
That's
we were.
we were ignoring the fact that you were coming into the room and just kept talking.
I know, but now I want to know.
Okay, good. I wanted to talk about this. So he said we should read Aurora Lee. So I bought it and I'm into it's a wonderful read. I'm into the second book. The poetry is so natural. It's completely delightful. Her images are fantastic. It does have the frustration of poetry of being mysterious and vague. And so I want to have other people to talk, because like there's some things like I don't quite get what she's doing here, but I just was reading the second book this morning where she gets proposed to by somebody, and the whole interchange is about male and female views of what marriage will be about from the Victorian perspective. It was really great.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So future book group discussion.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to say, if you're Jane Eyre, I think if you know Jane Eyre, you can put those two together. It's interesting.
It'd be
Right.
very interesting to compare the two.
Yeah.
Oh,
Jane
well,
Eyre and anything Jane Austen too would be really interesting to compare with this Aurora Lee, I think. But I'm only into book 2, so there's quite a bit more to go.
Yeah. Well, it's in years it's pretty close, to Jane Eyre, and also as you make more progress in it, I think some things will strike you. Anyway, I discovered it in college. I had never read it growing up or anything, but I had a teacher in college who was very enthusiastic about it and said that it was much more interesting than the songs from the Portuguese, which are fine, but which we all know. But she said this is the one you really need to read. So I did.
interesting.
Yeah, it's good.
So I wanted to quickly mention, just in regard to last week's discussion, that I think shortly after our discussion, I opened, there's something called the Free Press by Barry Weiss that's been organized by Barry Weiss, if some of you know her, the journalist who left the New York Times and is trying to create a space where she can rebuild integrity in journalism. So that's the task, she's an ambitious task she set for herself. But I became a subscriber recently simply because she has a weekly installment by Douglas Murray on 14 lines of poetry that he's committed to memory because he loves it so much. So I wanted to know what poetry he's memorized, and he offers descriptions of why, and it even comes with audio clips of him reading the 14 lines, which is a real pleasure too. So anyway, last week's I was playing catch up on a few weeks that I hadn't read. And the first thing he said was, one of the odd things about poetry is that people head to it in times of crisis or unusually heightened emotion. Poetry is not especially useful when describing the state of traffic heading downtown. It is not required for summing up the pleasures of shopping. But there are moments when only poetry will do as the most distilled form of communication possible. Consider how people not just read, but often try to write poetry upon the death of someone they love, or when they are falling in love, especially for the first time. And shortly after that, I opened an email from Grace Steele, my colleague, fellow literature teacher, and she's started something called Tending Roses. I'm going to put links to both of these in the chat once I finished reading this, but she's just started a series on poetry, and it opened, poetry contains the heights of human joy, the depths of sorrow, and every shade in between, distilled into language so sincere, so lovingly chosen, that nothing compares to its power to make us feel. And it was just fascinating to see the same sentiment. We weren't quite sure it had been demonstrated why poetry has that power after our discussion last week. But it seemed to be, Bennett's feeling seemed to be that it captures the heights of emotion, that it is distilled in this way that gives it an intensity that's not like any other kind of writing. And then I saw that theme back to back and things that came into my inbox right after.
It's one thing it seems to be a theme here. He repeats several times is just idea and emotion, thought and passion. They go together. They influence one another, and the combination of them influences our lives. Poetry, and I want to extend that to song. So not just poetry without music, but the music is always poetic. The mode of poetry involves both of those things in a way that affects life. So I think that's something that's really coming out to me in reading this book and all the other things he's telling us we have to read. So
I think you've gotten to the basic theme that appealed to me so strongly when I read this book, and the reason that I wanted to share it with everybody is the idea that it's that combination of intellect with passion with impact on life, and that's the whole point. All of those have to come together. And my experience taking literature classes in high school and college was that there was something very detached about our reading, in part because we spent too much time analyzing literary devices, or we were taking too historical a perspective, or maybe the teacher was just going through the motions because this was something that had been handed down as a curricular mandate or something. But there wasn't this feeling that you must read this because it will change your life. And that's why I love this last chapter of mental stock taking, that if you haven't felt it as much as you've understood it, and you haven't drawn from that an experience that comes back to you constantly in daily life and informs your everyday experiences and shines light on them and intensifies them, then you haven't really read at all. So that's, I think that's true.
challenging.
Yeah.
One of the element that comes in, I think you see it in Bennett, but even much more strongly in Hazlitt, is imagination, the connecting role that imagination has between all of those elements, and the way in which poetry speaks to the imagination more powerfully than prose, I think.
And well, you and I have had conversations about imagination before, and I still find myself grappling with the concept, at least I think as you understand it. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what you think that means, what it means for it to appeal to the imagination.
Well, before I do, I'm wondering, because it was really surprising to me that Lisa, as wonderful she is about literature, and we connected because I got so enthused by her lectures on literature that I saw, that for her to think about literature in terms of imagination is it's kind of foreign and even almost distasteful.
No, that's too strong.
Is that too strong?
That's too strong. It's not distasteful. It's that, I mean, obviously it uses the imagination, but I'm not sure. I still don't have clearly in my mind what is the separation between intellect and imagination, whether imagination is just a particular use of the intellect, or exactly what's being stressed by the idea of imagination.
Well, before saying more, just what do other people, what's your reaction to that view? So Hazlitt starts off early by saying poetry is the language of the imagination and the passions. And he seems to really be distinguishing it from the intellect and idea side, though he brings that in later on. But I mean, does that literature and imagination would go hand in hand? Does that seem strange to you, or make just immediate sense, Molly?
Yeah, I would like a definition of imagination, because it sounds like you might be talking about two different things. If I were going to try to define it in a groping sort of way, I would say it's a playful stretching of the intellect to connect things that maybe wouldn't ordinarily be connected. So not in a rational sense that this is logically related, but that it reminds you in an emotional sense. So that's kind of where I would start with it. And I think that would get us toward metaphor, which is maybe the basis of imagination. But
Mm.
what do you think of that?
I think that's definitely how we use it. Like when you say you're imagining something, it's often something that's like kind of unreal, but also at least the way we talk about it at TC and the way that some of the some people have talked about it, some philosophers, imagination is also just like the faculty that allows you to picture things, right?
Mhm.
So just the fact, like recalling images to your mind is a
Mm.
faculty of imagination, not reason quite. So if I picture a triangle, I'm imagining a triangle. I'm not reasoning about it, or like that's not my intellect isn't the thing doing that really.
I like that that's getting to the root of the word too, because that's probably more what is meant, because it has the word image in it.
I think it fits with
I
what
just want to
you're
express
saying,
like
Seeley. Sorry.
I just want to say I'm very sympathetic to Lisa's hesitancy about the word imagination, because when I hear it, it just sounds like a cliche of, heard all my life of like, oh, art is about imagination. What are you talking about? It just feels so woozy. But I think I'm agreeing broadly with what Greta's saying. I guess it's just when I think about literature, I think like, well, Madame Bovary or Anna Karenina. Like those are very concrete, specific, realistic kind of novels. In what sense are those imaginative? And I used, for me, like, okay, well, it's imagining like all these little details just sort of perfectly adding up and being recombined in this wonderful texture. But it just that's not at least the normal way I'd use the word imaginative, but I think it would apply under the way Greta's talking
Yeah,
about.
so Anna never existed in ever. She's not a real person.
Mhm.
She was concocted by Tolstoy and then lived in Tolstoy and then in everybody who's read that since. So it's imagination is certainly connected in the way I think about it is what allows us to let Anna Karenina be.
Mhm.
I think I'll
Right.
agree with that.
There's one way of using it that just kind of seems to reduce it to a trivial point, and I know the point you're making is not trivial. So
Mhm.
it's trying to grasp what is the substance of it. So let me just throw out a couple of things. So one part of that is in what Greta said. Greta, tell me if this is what you meant. It does come up in my discussions of literature a lot that something is being kind of reduced to an essence that essence doesn't exist in reality. That essence is created or imagined by the artist. And then the essence tells us something about reality around us.
Mhm.
So part of it is the kind of distilling to an essence that we have the power to do because we can't see a perfect triangle, but we can conceive of a perfect triangle. And then the conception of that with the use of imagination will shed light on the imperfect things we see around us. And that's so the other aspect that seems like maybe it's part of it is projection of an ideal, not an ideal necessarily in the sense of the perfect thing that we're striving for, but an ideal like the perfect depiction of that thing that then can become a reference point for experience in reality. I don't know. Does that sound connected to?
That resonates a lot with me.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody said that it's not necessarily or utilizing reasoning or the intellect, but to me, it's almost like one of the most potent forms of reasoning, because it's taking what you can see, trying to separate out all the attributes, and distill it to an essence. And even it's not just literature, but I'm doing a lot of science right now and looking at the history of astronomy, and the way, Eudoxus tries to imagine what's going on with the stars turning around in the sky, and he starts thinking about these giant spheres that might be there to explain what's going on. That's imagination too, I think. I'm trying to distill all the stuff he's seeing down to what might explain it at the most essential level.
Mhm.
I think then that I'm not sure if you'd agree with this. And Aristotle's got a chapter on the imagination where that's the hardest. In some ways, that's the hardest aspect of his analysis of the soul. The hardest thing he has to deal with is to try to figure out what imagination is. So it's not an easy thing. Precisely, I think, because of some things coming up here. But if we were to say that imagination is what allows us to almost sensibly present to ourselves something which we've never experienced, and that can be more or less controlled by the mind. So it happens spontaneously to everybody, but then it becomes an incredibly important and powerful tool for us to think about the world, even though it's not as abstract as thought is, but they work hand in hand, because imagination can present as a sensibly real thing what the intellect is thinking about.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the point about sensibly present, there's a section in The Closing of the American Mind when Alan Bloom is talking about literature, and Ayn Rand in the Romantic Manifesto makes this same point, that there are times that summoning a character to mind will bring with it everything that goes along with that character, but it's a summation of this thing that's been created by imagination that's easier. Trying to summon the set of characteristics of that person would be much more challenging than summoning the character. The character then comes to represent that set of characteristics.
Yeah, so because the mind would have to list everything separately.
Mhm.
With the imagination, you get them in a whole in the way in which you do somebody you really know,
Mhm.
and then the mind can analyze the imagined character, right? You can think about Anna Karenina or Gandalf, and
Mhm. Mhm.
think about, well, what you would analyze. Your mind would try to grasp them in a very similar way to the way you would somebody you actually knew.
Mhm. Let's see, Chad, did you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. I really appreciated this part of the discussion about imagination in particular. I just want to say I have, I've heard about aphantasia, this thing like where people can't picture things. I don't honestly know if I have it or not. I've heard it's more like a spectrum, but I'm like very low on the visual imagination side of things. But I can still like imagine ideas spatially and like kind of picture them interacting, but like if I want to picture a cow or something, I don't know. I don't really get much of an image. Maybe I can recall some memory, but not like creatively picture things. So anyway, I've been wondering, like Richard Feynman had this really interesting insight about how people use their mental faculties in different ways. And so like he and another physicist counted, one by visualizing the numbers and the other by repeating them audibly, like using your internal monologue. And they could do different things simultaneously to counting than one another. Like one of them could count some, or could like read or talk, and the other like could sort laundry, but they couldn't do the complementary thing. And I was just thinking about like, this has kind of been going through my head a lot through this course, which is just that like in connecting to poetry or literature or anything like that, like I find it very hard to connect to very descriptive, like visually descriptive language. I just kind of, my mind wanders and I get lost and I have to keep rereading and rereading and rereading. But people use metaphor or other types of like ways of connecting things. I relate to much better. And I was just thinking about like, how our responses are probably very individualized. And I haven't quite put it all together exactly how I think about it in my head, but I just thought it was worth mentioning in this context of imagination being like visual and metaphor and all these other things, that there's probably something complicated going on, like for each of us interacting with the work.
Yeah, that's
I'm
something
interested.
that,
Yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Well, that's something that comes up a lot because especially like when we were reading some of the other philosophers and how they think about imagination. But yeah, I don't really picture things either. Like one of my teachers one time, he was like, yeah, when someone says the word triangle, there's a particular triangle that comes into my head that I see. And it's a black outline and this and that. And I was like, I don't relate to that at all. When someone says triangle, I don't have a particular triangle in my head. But he thought that was everyone was like that. But I think that the imagination, it doesn't, I think especially with what you're saying about being more or less visual, like there's still a way that it's present to you even if it's not visually present. So I think imagination encompasses that kind of presence that's not enumerated into like concepts exactly, but doesn't necessarily have to be visual either. So I'm not one of those people who's really bothered when they see a movie adaptation of a book because the characters look nothing like what I was picturing, because I wasn't really picturing them, but they're still present to my imagination as a person, even if that how it's brought to me is not exactly visual, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it would involve all of the sense powers. So you can imagine the feel of a soft mitten or something like that, as much as you can imagine what it looks like.
It does make me wonder though, there's a category of people in my life who don't read literature ever and are not drawn to it in any way. And they've always perplexed me. Very intelligent, very creative people who just seem averse to literature. And I've been torn between thinking it's something about their history with literature and it's something about them and the way their mind works that it just doesn't appeal. And Chad, your explanation has me wondering whether that's a little part of it.
Well, I think that comes back to something we talked about in the first session about, is literature the only way to get some of these values, and are some people getting equivalent values from music or from other forms of art? And maybe it is an individual difference thing. Maybe some things reach some people better. I don't know.
But I do think it, at least I think that this is connected with Hazlitt's emphasis on it, and I think also Bennett would agree with this, that the imagination is the act of imagination is what engages the passions with the mind. That there's a without the imagination, I think there'd be a divide between the passion and the idea. But the imagination allows us to embody it in something which can excite us.
As you say that, I think one of the challenges I have is separating out. I know that we mean something specific when we say imagination, but I don't think of it as so distinct from just reasoning in general. So I think that's the struggle that I have is in our conversations about it, at least so far, whether to talk about it as this kind of separate faculty as opposed to a dimension of what the mind does.
Nolly?
I think of it more as a dimension. And I wonder, do you think that imagination is like we need that in order to define words?
Could you say what you said again? I didn't quite get the first part.
Do we need it even just to create definitions, or do you mean even just to conceptualize things? Is that
yes?
Yes. Okay.
I think
now we're going to get really into philosophy. Are you on Plato's side or Aristotle's?
Well, I think there's also two different ways to look at imagination. One is the process of creating, And then there's the imagining what someone else has created and connecting with it, which is more what we're doing in reading literature. But how it came about, how it came to be, how did they imagine Anna Karenina or whoever, the Dream Children? How did those come into being from some real person and real details? What does that process look like? That might help us understand how we can connect with the final end result of the literature. So the creative process in all the arts, I think, taps into what is imagination. And if maybe we understand one way of making art, we can understand how to appreciate another form of art.
Well, this is a rich and tempting topic, but I do feel like we should give our attention to Bennett first out of loyalty to the project. So maybe we can see if there's time left over at the end to come back to it. So let's see. We could start just the first chapter we read was the broad counsels. And there were some really interesting things there. One I had a question about. He says the final test by which you must, this can't be, I must have written this down very badly because he wouldn't repeat test. The final test for every book is, does it seem to you to be sincere and true? And then this is a quote, honesty in literature as in life is the quality that counts first and counts last. And then he said, he didn't mean by true to literal fact. He means true to the plane of experience in which the book moves, which didn't help me a great deal. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by true. So I was just curious if anyone had any thoughts about that section. A true book is not always great, but a great book is never untrue. Obviously, most of the books we've read, or most of the books in the Read With Me catalog, have very different perspectives on life and the world. So in one sense, they can't all be simultaneously true, but maybe he means something different by truth. I don't know.
Well, when I read that, I also thought of the fact that earlier in the book, he said that the thing about literature is that it gives pleasure to people. So, and then I thought, okay, well, what's the connection then between truth and pleasure? And I was thinking of like nature and how, you know, we get this sense of pleasure from looking at a beautiful sunset or looking at the mountains or those things in nature, and how it is pleasurable, and that maybe the truth is that kind of pleasure, like when somebody really captures some truth about the human experience, that it gives us that sense of that we're looking at something beautiful that harmonizes somehow.
Well, like the way I was thinking about truth here is an author, if he really has been thinking about the world seriously, then there's going to be, even if his ultimate perspective is wrong, there's still going to be aspects of life that he's going to capture perfectly. Like Madame Bovary, like I don't think Flaubert is right about life. There's more to life than is in Madame Bovary, but damn it, he's completely recreated a certain corner of human existence. You know, Homais and Emma and Rudolph and all these other guys. That's completely true to life in that part of life, even if not overall. And like that's true.
But does that square with him saying the book must be true? I just don't. Not illuminate some aspect of life. I don't know.
Well, I would say the author, at least, maybe it's at least the author meant it. Like the author really did some very hard thinking, and you feel with him why he feels that way.
Well,
he's not faking it.
Maybe it would be helpful to take the opposite perspective and say, well, what would it mean for a book to be untrue?
Propaganda.
Propaganda. So one of the things he said is don't be fooled by a book that flatters you. And I don't, again, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but I do have in my own mind examples of books that people like because it gives them a feeling of confirmation, just kind of a vague feeling of confirmation. And not that it's challenging them or expanding their scope in any fundamental way. So that's one I thought of.
I don't know if you've had the experience of reading a book that's incredibly well written, and yet you feel like throughout the vision is warped. There's something you're always sort of having to warp yourself and what you think is worthwhile to fit with it, or that's the author's view of things. And it's a very it's an unpleasant experience, not a it's not so much a disturbing experience, but an unpleasant experience of seeing somebody kind of twist in very powerful ways something you think is lovely and worthwhile.
Like an example for me of a book I found deeply unpleasant and I felt false. I hope I don't offend anyone, but C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I really, really disliked that book. It just felt gross on a certain level. It felt like he was just not being straightforward. Now, I want to say, I can like Christian literature. I love St. Augustine's Confessions because he feels like he's really trying to grapple with issues in a serious way, and he's really tortured about things. But that book felt like, yeah, Lewis, you're very clear, you're very evocative writer, and the rest. But I feel like you're BSing yourself on this one.
I think, Greta, aren't you a fan of Mere Christianity? No, that's not the one.
I haven't read that one. I mean, I've started it like 5 times and never actually gotten through it. It was started out off as a radio thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a nonfiction radio.
There's one that you like.
Session he did. Yeah, he has a bunch of like shorter fiction ones that I've read, like the Screw Tape Letters and The Great Divorce and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. And I also, it being transcribed from a radio show I think is interesting too. And I think the audio is available, but yeah, I don't know about that one.
Ian's got his hand up.
What came to my mind was a very different kind of book. Also,
is it Lolita? Because that's what I was thinking.
Lolita, yes, I would put that in that category. But no, it was something called The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. Did anybody read that? It was very popular about 15 years ago, I think, and it was strongly recommended to me, and I read it for a while on the airplane and then ceremoniously threw it into the trash on the layover. But it wasn't, so he does describe, and we've discussed this quite a bit before, don't confuse contempt with anger. If it moves you to anger, chances are that it's a good book. There were those scenes in Anna Karenina that moved me to anger. This was contempt. It felt like my brain and spirit were being twisted into contortions that were unhealthy. So maybe that's false. I don't know. I guess, it did feel to me like pretense. It felt to me like pretense of literary style. And that might be the version of the falseness that he's talking about, just pretense. Ian has been wanting to say something.
Yeah, so Lisa, you mentioned that line and I forget exactly how it goes, but things don't have to be true in the literal sense, but do they fit within the plane of the universe of the book or something like that? Mm-hmm. I took that to mean, do the events in the book, do the developments of the characters, do the things that they say fit within the context of the universe, of the world that the author has created? Mm-hmm. So to pick a crazy example, if you're in a science fiction book and people start flying, you're like, okay, it's science fiction, that can happen. But if it's in a non-science fiction book and that happens, you're like, well, this is a weird development that doesn't quite fit, doesn't quite sit right, it doesn't ring true. And that's the way I took it to mean. You can create a world, and then whether or not you're being does your writing have integrity to the world that you've created? Is the way I took that to mean. And then outside of imaginative literature, I think of people like Paul Krugman as an example of someone who writes disingenuously, because it's just, he says things that are so easily demonstrably untrue, and he doesn't care because he knows he's writing to a particular audience that won't question that because they agree with his opinions. And that's another example to me of not ringing true, that it's like the Elsa Tui stuff. Like, you're clever enough to know that you're wrong, but you're evil enough to say it anyway.
I have a really unromantic reading of the first one that you brought up, and I think it's the one about they don't have to be true literally. I think there he's just saying it just doesn't have to be historical, but it has to be true in its own right. And I think that, like, cohesiveness with the universe is right, but I think he's talking about something more than that, because I think that a book can be true, like, it can not have any plot holes or anything like obscenely that doesn't fit within the universe created, but it still can be a warped vision of reality. And so what they're presenting to you as desirable or something like that is so undesirable that you have to contort your soul to pretend that what's being presented is real or worthwhile. And that's why I always worry that I hate Lolita for the wrong reasons, but I think I'm okay. Like, I think I just hate it, and it is bad. And I think part of that is, I don't know, even if Nabokov is presenting the main character as evil, he's not doing, like, it's not enough. The world is so warped in it that I have to warp my own soul to pretend to enjoy it. And then the other one I was thinking of, which I think will also be unpopular, at least with Mr. Seeley, my opinion on this, is that I don't like, oh my gosh, wait, no, I can't remember her name. Who's the Catholic writer, the short story? Flannery O'Connor. Yeah, I really dislike her. And the only word I can use to describe her writing, it won't be unpopular with you? Or? Yeah, the only word I can ever use to describe her writing and explain why I dislike it is it feels contrived. She is the only author I've ever read where things happen in her books and characters do things, and my first reaction is they wouldn't do that, which is a bizarre, like, that is a bizarre reaction to have to a book, because she's creating the characters, but I still have this feeling of like, she made that up, but which of course she did, but you don't have that reaction when you're reading something like Tolstoy. You don't feel like, oh, like, they wouldn't have done that. It's like, yes, they would have done that, and I could have seen that coming. Yeah.
One way you might think about it would be, and I think this is more maybe getting to Bennett when he says true to the plane of experience, is that you could believe that the things that happen, kind of what Greta was saying, you can believe that these people exist, and by thinking about them, if you knew them and you thought about them, you would gain greater insight into reality. So that the presentation being offered in the story is one that allows your mind to see more deeply into more permanent and important things.
So
yeah, because
it's not just internally consistent. It's not just true within the author's vision, but it's also something that's worth your dwelling on and living with, because through it you live more really and truly yourself.
Because I think that's why the wording "true to the plane of experience" is so important. Is that what you're going to say too?
No,
yeah, like true to the plane of experience is so important, is because it's this understanding that the world is maybe not being experienced in the same way by everything, but that we're all apprehending a common thing, and like the truth of the world or something like that. And so it has to be true to the truth of the world, even if, like, that's why internal consistency isn't, I don't think that's quite what he's talking about, because you can have something internally consistent that isn't apprehending something that's true to the world and to experience.
Yeah, so if anybody's done any Lobachevsky geometry, the non-Euclidean geometry, it's internally consistent. There's some things which are really compelling about it, but you have to warp your imagination at every step of the way in order to follow him, because it's against the grain of the human imagination.
Yeah, because you have to go up to the board and draw a curved line and say, here's a straight line, and see it intersects this other one. And everyone goes, but the diagram doesn't look like it. And you say, shut your imagination off. Just like, and that's where it's interesting, because that's one of the only geometries where you're not using your imagination. It seems like you're only using your intellect, because you have these definitions for things, but the definitions don't match at all what your imagination wants to present you with.
Well, I just have to, being a PhD in mathematics, I just have to say that you can't imagine hyperbolic geometry. You just need the right setting. Like, you just can't, it's as in, it's like, yeah, don't imagine it as a 2D board. You imagine it as, like, oh, it's this sort of saddle surface or something like that. But I have to also mention about Lolita. I guess this is going to make me unpopular, but I have to say, like, I did love that novel. Like, I found it fascinating and delightful from beginning to end. So I don't know what that says about me, but I will say that it was true. Like, I do. It's a horrible perspective on life, or to be so amoral, but there's not a paragraph in there I wouldn't defend.
Yeah, I think that's one that might be my personal ire, where I just find the subject matter too disgusting. But I agree, like, the writing is probably pretty good and it's probably true. I don't want to hear it. Like, it's too gross for me. But that, not to say that, yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to how my mom hates Tarantino, and I can't quite get myself to hate him as much because he's too cool. Like, the movies they're compelling, and my mom is just more moral than me, and so she watches Inglourious Basterds and really hates it, and I watch it and I'm like, oh, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm in between of it's utterly captivating and just filthy. I mean, fetish over gore almost. But anyway.
Well, I think the words that I would want to replace for true, just for it to work for me, is coherent and earnest and insightful. So yes, Lolita, I feel like I have to purge my soul after even say Lolita might have, I can allow that one might have some coherence and earnestness in a way to it. I feel reluctance at the second, but I could be convinced. But the book that I was talking about before, the corrections, nobody could persuade me that I don't think I'd have the discussion. But you can tell when there's a lack of earnestness and it's about something else. It's about some kind of mental game that feels false.
But that's why I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention Lewis again, because I don't know. I have a complicated relationship with Lewis. I read the Screwtape Letters when I was really young, and it put me on a mindset of there's always something behind your thought. Like, nobody's sincere almost. You're always lying to yourself somehow, which was in some ways good, I guess. Like, it got me thinking in a more a deeper way, I suppose. But on the other hand, it brought in that sense of, I don't know, skepticism maybe, or that there is no sincerity. And that's how Lewis makes me feel about the world, is that nobody's sincere, and he's going to laugh at you for your insincerity, and he's going to make you laugh at yourself along with him. But there's no, in anything that I've read about him, there's really no redemption in that. It's just, let's all be ridiculous and then get saved. And that's that's and so I would actually put Lewis on a list of authors that just make me feel like I am in his sort of warped vision of the world and not seeing reality clearly. That's
not insightful. In fact, the opposite of it. It prevents you from having insight almost.
Yeah, almost, or a sort of insight that's just a sort of cynicism. But yeah.
I'm not able to contribute to this conversation because I've only read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Shoshana?
Yeah. I think maybe a word that we could use would be integrity. Okay, because I think one of the things that works that we could condemn would be works that lack integrity because they're spitting in their own faces and laughing at their own values. And I think that incoherent fits in there, but integrity is the positive. And Well, it means the same thing. It means all of a piece. And it doesn't necessarily, I mean, 93. And so it doesn't necessarily have to mean that people on opposite sides couldn't both have integrity. But you read that book, you don't feel unclean. And no matter whose consciousness you're inside, there is a kind of earnestness, there are values and so on. So I think integrity is a good word, even if it's not an adjective. Because well, it just, there ought to be an adjective, but I think that
let's just make one up. Integritus.
and the other, then I just very briefly, just because I can't let it go, about Lolita, because I don't feel comfortable having it be insulted when I don't agree. And here's what I would say, and just make it short. Do you remember the scene where Humbert is looking down into the valley and thinking about the voices? Well, it's almost like a mystery. Like if you're reading a mystery and then you get to the point where things are explained to you, and if you miss that and you don't know who committed the murder, you really missed the book. That's what Nabokov called the node of the book. And so if you don't remember that, maybe you could go look it up and come back and we can talk about it, because that's the scene in which basically Nabokov makes it all clear what you're supposed to think about the world, and even Humbert starts to get it. I'm just saying, and for those of you who are interested in such things, you can imagine that really that the valley he's looking down at looks just like Ouray. That's where it is, because Nabokov was there, and by coincidence he spent time in Switzerland when he was a child, as Ayn Rand did, and that looks like Switzerland. So it all kind of ties in together. But just go to, regardless of Ayn Rand, if you go to that scene and look at it, and then that opens up the book. Now, you might say you have to get pretty far in order to get there, and maybe a book should stand by itself, but mysteries don't work that way. You wouldn't judge a mystery by the first third because somebody looks guilty who isn't actually guilty, and the other way around, right? So it's a scene that I think does open up the book. Just saying, just because I can't let people insult Lolita, which is actually a very highly moral book, if you read the whole book and not just, it's like reading a mystery and not getting to the whole thing. And I did think of an example that of something that clearly doesn't work as far as being true, but it probably won't make sense to a lot of people. I'll give you the general situation. This is a musical which has wonderful songs, and someone wrote a new book for it. So now when you watch the musical, you've got someone's book that, in my opinion, clashes, and the characters don't understand their own songs anymore. Now, sometimes that can happen without there being two different authors involved, but you've got the feeling of the right pen doesn't know what the left pen is doing, and that these things are coming from different places. So you can have that even if it's a single author, but it's as if the characters don't, just what you were saying, the Flannery O'Connor, the character wouldn't do this. The character doesn't understand his or her own words. And I don't think Bennett would like that. And I don't think we would like that.
I think that's true, but I was thinking that also his conception of like what makes it good is also very like turned out from the book itself. So there's a lot of things that, like we're saying, within the book can make it good or bad, but I think he's also saying like the book in relation to reality and experience, that's what determines the truth of it or not. So it's, even though it's important that it's integrated within itself, what's more important is that it's integrated with the world.
Okay, so it would be good to know what he thinks is true about the world. If actually have to do that, then that in a way becomes something that has to be part of the book, or else it's not a complete statement. And I don't actually know. I mean, I've read a couple of his novels, and they're good. They're not, I didn't feel impelled to go read the rest of them, but he knew how to tell a story, and the characters were of some interest. The Old Wives' Tale is the one I remember, but I don't know if I know what he thinks is true about the world.
But I guess
I don't even know if he put his own book on the list.
Yeah, I was thinking that he doesn't have one thing that he's saying is true about the world, and if books agree with that, then they're right. I guess I'm just saying, like, there's a wealth of things to talk about in the world, and if you're right about any part of it or any aspect of it, then the book is true. So I mean, I talk about this with, oh sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just like, Vonnegut is someone I really like, who I think in a very fundamental sense is wrong about what he thinks about the world, because he thinks everything's meaningless and this and that, but he gets parts of it so right that I think I think his books are true enough to be good, maybe not great, but they're true enough to be good because he's getting parts so right. And so I think, yeah, maybe the degree to which a book is good is about how much of what it's saying about the world is right.
So I'm looking on page 66, this is in chapter 14. He, in the mental stock taking, he offers this test as to whether, or some test questions as to whether you're receiving from literature all that literature has to give. If a man is not thrilled by intimate contact with nature, if he is not troubled by the sight of beauty in many forms, if he is devoid of curiosity concerning his fellow men and his fellow animals, if he does not have glimpses of the unity of all things in an orderly progress, if he is chronically querulous, dejected, and envious, if he is pessimistic. I think that those express something of a philosophy of reality that that not everybody would agree with. So I don't know, that might help us get some insight into what he's thinking about true. If you have something that is, if you're reading a work of literature and you're reading it well, and it's leading you to neglect beauty, to not be curious about your fellow men, to be chronically querulous, dejected, and envious. If you have a book like that, then the problem is with the book, and it's not really, I think you'd say it's not true to the plane of experience, at least as he's thinking of it.
Can I
And I
go
think
back
that
1 minute to Lolita, because so Shoshana, if you say, if in your regard it is a moral book, then I believe that it is a moral book, and in the sense of the ultimate perspective that the book is taking is not a perverse and deranged one. What I'm wondering is whether, and I think this a lot, let me make a connection to articles on politics. Often somebody will write a very powerful article with something that I think is true, but they've included such perverse, grotesque, explicit details within it that I think those consume the reader's attention more than the point itself. And so there's this, or maybe not even consume their attention, but affect them more than the moral point being made. And that's what I wonder about Lolita. And there are lots of movies in this category for me too, that if you have a presentation of a heroic story, but the violence or the violent aspect of it is so graphic and so powerful and consuming, that what have I come away with really? Have I come away with the point that's trying to be abstractly made to me? Or have I come away kind of thrilled by scenes of violence against my better nature? So I think that's what it is. The experience for Lolita is for me is I can't read those scenes. It's too repulsive to me, whatever the point made is. So I wouldn't say it's not a great work of literature. Too many people I know and respect insist it is. You're not alone among people who have shook their heads at me for not, but I still do wonder about that.
Okay, well, I mean, you've read Les Miserables, we spend time in the sewer. You really start picturing this. I'm just saying.
Yeah. It's not the same as being in that guy's bed.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's no extended scenes with the Nardier where there's the scene, where he ambushes Jean Valjean, but the emphasis and focus is so much on Valjean's heroism in that scene that the balance is so clear in terms of the impact on you. So it's just a thought.
Okay.
I think the
Going back,
converse of that can be true as well. Like, I think there are some books where, well, maybe Anna Karenina is an example, although I haven't read that, where the actual, sense of life or sense of ultimate truth in the book is not what we would agree with or not positive even, but there are pieces of it, maybe characters or situations that are beautiful in themselves. And so we're getting that out of the book, even though the overall sense is not, which can maybe be dangerous. I don't know. Maybe it's dangerous to have that sense of life carried in a book that, gives it kind of a candy coating almost. Maybe not superficially so, but I don't
Well,
know.
it's just why you have to read so many books.
Right.
Well, on the
Takes the reins.
on the point of violence or how lurid a book is, like, or media is, I'd agree that sometimes there are things that are just like, okay, that's just outrage porn right there. Like that's why you're bringing all that stuff up. There are some books though where it's like, no, All Quiet in the Western Front, that's a very, very graphic book. I'm not going to describe how graphic it is, but there's viscera, and it needs to have that. Like, it's completely justified. The book would be imperfect without it. Like, you need to talk about the horrors. Like, that's a very important part of the book. Sequel moreover, but I just want to say, like, there is a place for that if it's done appropriately.
No, and I think, Greta acknowledged from the start that this might just be her, the one that she can't handle. There can be things where it's something very personal to you. Maybe it's just that it's about children, and my whole life is about safeguarding and empowering and making good lives for children. Maybe that's why that is the one. That's but yeah, that question of when and how can you bring in those elements and not have it be pornographic in some form.
Yeah, I was gonna go back to the list that you brought up of the list of tests, and I was thinking it's interesting given the conversations we've had about what he's including as literature, because it seems like you can kind of, maybe you can't sum up all of those, but it seems like exuberance for life is kind of what he's talking about. Is like, do you think the world is a good, interesting, worthwhile thing to think about? And that's why you might include something like Newton on the literature list, because he's exuberant about what he's doing, and that's kind of the only test. And even what he was saying about, is he a pessimist, it makes me think of Chesterton's essay about Byron, because like Byron is a pessimist, like he is, but I like Chesterton because he just kind of like laughs at him. He's like, no, he's not. He's what he is he's so great souled that he needs difficulty. And so he kind of makes up this difficulty, and he thinks he's a pessimist, but he's not. And so I think that also goes along with, like, authors might not always know what they're doing. And they might say, oh yeah, because that's with Vonnegut too, the world is meaningless and who cares? But he doesn't really think that, because you can tell by how he's writing that he thinks the world is a good and interesting place.
It goes back to that phrase from, I think it's from chapter 1, about the miraculous interestingness of the universe. That's the fundamental that defines literature.
On that, it is interesting though, there are authors who really do convey the meaninglessness of existence though, of like Douglas Murray, who you respect so much, Lisa. He recommends that author, Michel Houellebecq, a contemporary writer, and he basically is just writing about nihilism in modern Europe, and his books really capture exquisitely well just total nihilism of just there's nothing valuable in life whatever. He has this beautiful passage somewhere, I can't remember where now, but where he just says, like, like, the universe is a fundamentally shoddy thing, and of course there has to be happiness, only as bait to make us think there might be something better. Like, that is just so acid. It's beautiful, it's horrible.
But I think that's the point that, I mean, loosely, that Chesterton was making, is that in saying in beautiful words how expressing nihilism in beautiful words and making a compelling argument that this is important, that you understand this nihilistic viewpoint. Well, that in itself sounds at odds with true nihilism.
Yeah, it's self-defeating. Any pessimism in an artist is self-defeating, because whatever they're doing they thought was worthwhile. And so if they were truly pessimist or truly nihilist, why do you think nihilism in Europe is interesting at all if everything means nothing? Because at least it meant enough for you to write a book about.
Like Kutagawa, who's one of my other favorite authors, he has a passage towards the end of his life where he says that no, I don't have the will to live anymore, but I still have the will to create. And it's like, yeah, and well, and then he kills himself. But
creation's a part of living. So if he said he obviously at some point he didn't have the will to create because he killed himself, and so he no longer had the will to create anything. But like creation is a part of life. So saying, "Oh, I hate life, I only want to create," it's like, what do you think? Prerequisite for creation is living.
Okay, I'm going to share something personal. There was a period in my life where I remember where I was feeling very nihilistic for various reasons, and where I remember, like, the real symbol of this to me was I remember looking at an apartment building, some shabby looking apartment building, feeling like, why do all these human beings hassle, like to make this, like eating and going to work and going to the bathroom and all whatever, and dealing with insurance claims. Like, why are they bothering in this shabby kind of universe? What's the good of it? And I could still see in the there's a certain feeling of like, yeah, but maybe I want to express that, even though it's like the universe is a shabby place. There's still this internal sense of, yeah, but I kind of want to put that down on paper. So you can have kind of both feelings. Like you don't feel a will to live, but you do feel a will to create. Right? That was in the past. I'm not that way anymore.
Yeah, I'm not denying those two feelings can exist. I'm just wondering if the first is really, I mean, maybe this is a rude thing to say, but I wonder if the first is totally genuine. Because I don't think you can, if you're a real nihilist or a real pessimist, then nothing's worth anything, right? So you can't say, I guess maybe I'm wrong about what nihilism is too.
Well, no, I think you're right. There's a certain internal contradiction there. But I will say, at least when I felt that way, it's like, yeah, that was authentic. That was a really deep felt feeling. And it's like, yeah, like, you look at that shabby apartment building and, hundreds of people living there. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't think Bennett would want to say either that darkness or something isn't a part of the world, right? So sad feelings about the universe are real too. So that's whatever Flaubert does get wrong or right about the world. One of the things he gets right is the kind of feeling that people often have towards the world, like his kind of feeling that everyone is bad and just I don't know, like how he feels about Emma and stuff like that. It's those are feelings I've had too, and so he's right about that too. And but I think that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be exuberant about even knowing those things, if that makes sense.
Because I looked over his list of recommended works. If we had read all of them, like a good bookman should be able to say he has, then maybe we could draw out what actually counts for him as true. I'd like to go back to the mental stock taking section, because this is what meant the most to me, and just look at some of the things he says about what it takes to be able to say you've truly consumed literature and you really are a reader. So one here that I noted is, if reading has not given him faith, courage, vision, noble passion, curiosity, love, and a thirst for beauty, then he has not taken the gift. He is only half alive. And that goes back to the original first chapter again, when he says, he who has not read has not lived. He's only half alive, for it is only in the stress of fine ideas and emotions that a man may truly be said to live. That allows for a lot of kinds of emotions, I think. I mean, he is definitely stressing nobility, beauty, love, curiosity. He's stressing those as what make for a full life, having had those sorts of feelings aroused in you. But the section in Hazlitt said that tragic literature can arouse all those things too in its own way. So, but this idea that in the stress of fine ideas and emotions, only then can a man be said to truly live. I find that a very compelling and fascinating claim, because there is, I've always find myself using the term soul stretching to say what literature does for a person, but there's just this sense that you have to be confronted with the great thoughts in history, confronted with the minds of people who are engaged with the world at a fundamental level of insight and passion in order to learn what's possible in life, to be opened to what's possible in life and what can be experienced in life. And that if you don't have that, so I think my favorite section in the whole book, which I sent to Andrew earlier this week, was the most powerful, progress is a battle between human reason and human instinct. And he says, the former slowly but surely wins. The most powerful engine in this battle is literature. It is the vast reservoir of true ideas and high emotions, and life is constituted of ideas and emotions. In a world deprived of literature, the intellectual and emotional activity of all but a few exceptionally gifted men would quickly sink and retract to a narrow circle. That seems right to me, that we are inheriting generations of great thought, and by consuming it, it allows us to rise out of what would be our natural instinctive state and really learn how to understand the world and live.
That's a fantastic paragraph. That it's a thought that I had not heard before. Yeah.
Oh, I think it's the best paragraph in the whole book.
Yeah, Ian?
Yeah, I also really love that paragraph, and he just seemed to be saying that you're turning down the chance to stand on the shoulders of giants if you don't tap into this reservoir. But there was another section, which I think you're alluding to, Lisa, that I slightly took issue with. And it's where he was saying, how can you argue with the cabman? How can you be unhappy that your suburban train took repose in the tunnel when you've read such beautiful literature? And it just seemed to be him saying, don't sweat the small stuff. Don't sweat the trifles of daily experience when there's such grand beauty to experience. And I don't know, I had difficulty with that sentiment. I mean, on the one hand, instinctively understand it. On the other hand, much of my life, when I run a business, I have small children, much of my life is taking care of detail. I have someone along the line somewhere has to be aware of detail. And if the train stops in the tunnel, as they always do in England, it's because someone somewhere is not doing their job. And when you take the train in Japan, the train does not stop in the tunnel. It goes to its destination because someone somewhere is doing their job, because they're sweating the small stuff. So I don't know. I think I took somewhat issue with it.
I think I saw it more as not being consumed by that and not having it be all of life. So even in the description you just gave, you had this tedious experience, this kind of tedious disruption to your life, and you're extrapolating from that to the moral meaning of it. And that's kind of the power that literature gives you, is to be able to do that. Having had our minds expanded enables us to go from a concrete annoyance to something meaningful and profound. So I don't think a human being cannot be frustrated by annoyances and tedium. That doesn't sound normal to me, but having the more you've experienced beauty, the more you can be on the alert for that in life and really relish and value those experiences. That's sometimes I describe reading literature, as in fiction literature, as giving you X-ray vision into meaning of things, or kind of scanning your environment for what actually counts. And I think if you're not, I think those who truly have not read, if we could go back to a caveman image, they're not going to have the power to do that.
I would say, I've always felt like literature has given me a superpower to elevate those small details, right? So to see the meaning in those little details that help make the bigger whole, right? So almost to romanticize them.
Fantastic example of that. Now I'm in Shoshana remembers things about my life sometimes better than I do. Now I'm reversing that. So Joseph, when you had to get your passport renewed.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good example.
Share it.
Oh, you want me to tell it? Oh, so back, I guess, July, I don't know if any of you knew, but in Canada, I'm in Canada, and we had a notoriously horrible passport process. So I showed up at the passport office at 3 a.m. In July last year, and I was like number 67th in line. There were people camping out in front of the passport office. So I had this adventure of trying to get my passport, and it was actually really, I turned it into a positive experience. It ended up being quite enjoyable to just observe people's reactions in that environment, because it was a very high pressure situation. People had to fly the next day. In some cases, there was uncertainty on whether you would even get in to get your passport that day. I ended up being the last person through, but it was just is that what you meant?
Yes, but I specifically remember that you were reading Les Miserables, and I'm quite sure you even summoned the bishop in your mind at some point.
Yes, yeah, I was reading the bishop at the time, and I was thinking just about, instead of being upset and angry, how do I change how I look at this situation, and maybe look at it through the bishop's eyes.
But if they had closed the doors right before you, would you have slammed the book down in anger?
No, I had come to terms that it might not happen, and I had a plan for what I was going to do.
So
I do wonder if more people have read literature, when they're doing those small jobs that Ian describes, does the perspective shift, instead of it being, I'm the lowest man on the totem pole, maybe, who's flicking the switch, like, no, I'm part of this big system, and even my job has some meaning and a way to look at the meaning.
Well, I have another great phrase from within the book.
Molly's been waiting to get in.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Molly, go.
That's okay. I just wanted to say I really like the metaphor of the gift. The literature as a whole is a gift that we get from all these writers over centuries. And how dare we ignore that gift, or not send a thank you note, or not do mental stock taking after they put so much effort into these books, to just really relish all the value that's in these books. It was just a very nice, succinct way of seeing all of literature as just one present in a box to you personally. That's a nice image.
Even I think that, at least with some works where I really disagree with the author, what the author thinks of reality, yet it's super helpful to me to see why, if he's being honest, even if he's deeply pessimistic or nihilistic, if he's being honest, I can see what it is in the world he sees that has brought him to that, and that really expands my sympathy with humanity. If not
another idea I remember getting from The Closing of the American Mind was that great literature doesn't just provide answers, it conceptualizes the questions. So there's an enormous value in just having somebody draw your attention to a question of life that has to be answered, even if you don't agree with the answer that they provide.
So So I was thinking that we should talk about next steps because I'm all fired up. Bennett has got me convinced that I need to
good.
be more systematic. I was already trying to remedy my lack of a college education. I never went to college. So I was doing it, but in a haphazard way. And so I'm fired up, but not sure what specific process I should follow, or if they're, or is it that each person can, I took a shortcut. I got 1,000-page volume of poems instead of buying all the books that he said. I just got one from Chaucer to Frost, all the poems. And I got the book that Lisa recommended, and I got this, and I bought a lot of books related to Shakespeare, of whom I have read only 2 plays in the past. But this morning I was thinking, a list is overwhelming in a way, because I could go in so many directions. I don't know if if people have any advice for me or for us, what are we going to, those of us who have like me, have had less, or have read less literature than others.
One suggestion, first I want to say, I think it's a crime that we all have to start as adults down this road. If we'd been educated properly, much of it would have been accomplished already. And that's an endless frustration for me. I have to quickly mention again, my frustration with the student-directed classroom in relation to this idea, because student-directed classrooms are making kids quickly sink and retract into a narrow circle because they're not being offered this broad base of the great products of the great minds of history. So anyway, it is, I think, for everyone, especially those who didn't have the benefit of going to TAC, even trying to start now seems daunting and impossible. But one thing I wanted to suggest is just make it a time commitment and then follow whatever path intrigues you. So you have those books to start with. And if you just make a time commitment to each day, the fact of engaging and engaging with and absorbing yourself in truly great work does change your feeling about life and the world. I've just started reading Middlemarch again, and I'm going to, I think, prepare a chapter a day reading of Middlemarch, like the Les Miserables experience. And waking up each morning and spending half an hour to an hour in the world of Middlemarch changes my life. It totally transforms my life. So I think that's my comfort to you. In one sense, it's impossible. And on the other hand, just a time commitment to.
But also, I thought Bennett's advice in the beginning, start with something that you know is really worthwhile, and then follow the connections that arise with somebody you've connected with. So I'm looking forward to reading the Wordsworth he talked about, and now I'm reading Aurora Leigh, and now I want to read the letters between her and her husband, and that sounds like a really good beginning point. It's not it seems like after you've done that and followed a few paths and gotten the just the taste, the enjoyment and the taste for that kind of literature and whatever you're describing. Then he said, now you want to set yourself a goal, like, I'm going to read 6 Shakespeare plays with some commentary, with somebody that's going to help me listen to some lectures that are going to help me get into this in a big way. Then you sort of set yourself finite, manageable tasks, but serious ones. That seems like a really good advice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
And here's our plug for Read With Me, because everything in the Read With Me library is, I think, selected by Lisa and worth a reading. Now I am working on a path so that you can, not even have to decide which books to choose. But in the meantime.
Oh, I thought Lisa told you, Lisa canceled that idea of.
I vetoed her. I overruled her.
You're going to do it anyway?
I'm doing it anyways.
I guess I would say something else, which is that if something is worth reading, it's probably worth reading at least twice, and that the experience of reading it for the second time you become a better reader and you see more of it. And this is a book you already invested in, and now you're getting more out of it. It just yeah, when I was starting out, I used to read everything 3 times, and I thought everybody did.
Did you do it in a row, or did you do it like you'd read something else in between?
Well, I was in school, and so I had to read lots of things, but if I liked it, I was going to read it 3 times. And I remember once I in school, I was about to take a test, and I said, kind of nervous. I've read it only twice. And and the person I said it to kind of looked at me like, what's wrong with you? Because I thought everyone did that, because that's, you're getting practice. That's the way you do it. And now, well, that's one of the nice things about teaching, right? Is that you get to read something you love over and over again. But I think it's good, especially if it's something somewhat unfamiliar to you, because the first time you're getting the map and you're getting a sense of what the whole is. And then when you're reading it the second time, you can linger and you don't.
That's what I had that experience so profoundly with Brothers Karamazov, because I read that in high school and I loved it. And I think I got a decent understanding of it, but the whole first 100 pages made no sense to me. And that might have been the translation I was using too. I have strong opinions about the translation that I probably am not knowledgeable enough to actually have. But the second time I read it, like, it made sense to me. Whereas the first time I felt like for a long time I was just fumbling through and had no idea what was being talked about. But that's one of the only books I think I've read that one 3 times. And like, yeah, I know it much better than anything else that I've read. I still don't remember the plot at all, but
having made a career of having been paid to reread great books a lot, it's amazing. I may have already said this, but sometimes with these seminar readings, we had so much to do. I think I'm just going to blow through this one because I know it and whatnot. And I just read the first few pages, and then I have to read through the whole thing because I'm caught up again. I see things so much more deeply the third or fourth time I go through. But Molly?
Yeah, I wanted to know what you thought of the mental stock taking chapter, whether he gives enough emphasis to how you do that stock taking. Like, he doesn't specifically say that you should discuss it or write about the book. He just says, make sure you apply it when you're talking to the cabman. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, gosh, I really need to spend more time with these books that I race through reading. Even if I read them twice, I don't stop and think about them before moving on to the next novel. And maybe I should spend more time summarizing or finding the theme or doing the kinds of things that Lisa does with the Read With Me books. Because when I do that, I get so much more out of them on that second reading that, and I remember them more. I remember the lessons that I want to make part of me.
He doesn't say this in his chapter on mental stock taking, but I've felt like Read With Me and the pace I take with it. So I'm doing Jane Eyre right now. And then I do 3 kind of little sections of commentary on every 2 or 3 chapters. Well, a person doesn't have to do that when they're reading a book, but I've described it as high intensity literary training, that it just gets you really in the habit. I'm kind of trying to draw out what's happening in my mind as I'm reading the chapter and draw it out and explain it explicitly. And then I'm guiding a reader through that mental process. But I think that mental stock taking comes more naturally, and it's not that as you go along. If you've done that early on, and again, this is the failing of our education. If we had all been guided chapter by chapter through great works of literature over the course of K-12 education, and then even more deeply in college, then we'd be really good at reading books and extracting the meaning as a natural, almost instinctive process, I think. So
you're saying to do it as you read chapter by chapter rather than at the end, okay, now what does it mean?
I would do it chapter by chapter as you read. I would do it selectively just on some books. I don't think it's healthy to stop and ponder laboriously over every chapter in every book you read. It's at odds with the kind of natural flow of taking in a work of when now I'm talking about fiction specifically here. But I do wonder whether mental stock taking is something that if it were built into education, it would be we'd be good at that already and wouldn't necessarily need to do it so explicitly.
I think one of the
when we're-
practices is pretty common, and Lisa seems to do it a lot, is just writing down quotations from a book, either as you're going along, or you don't want to interrupt the reading experience too much, or go back and reflect and try to remember some of the particularly insightful things you thought were said, and then have a 2 or 3 page of quotations from it would be a great way of trying to capture it, and then being able to go back to it again at some point.
Mhm.
And I thought John,
Something that was, yeah,
ahead.
I wanted to call out what was in the chat too, because that really resonated with me as well. How he was bringing in the idea of meditation, especially for me, as I've been doing a chapter a day of Les Mis. I found it a much more effective substitute to other forms of meditation. So just having that, point in the day to focus on something and, think about it and read Lisa's commentary on it. I love that idea of meditation.
I also, this is probably one of the lesser forms of meditating on books, but since I don't have social media, but I'm still 22, my substitute is that when I find quotes, I just text them to like 10 different people, and then you kind of demand people to talk to you about them a little, even if they haven't read the book. But it's just nice to, like, sharing things with people too is really good. And obviously there's better and worse ways to do it. It'd be better if it were in person or maybe over the phone, but like I said, I'm young and that's not how people communicate anymore. So but yeah, I think, and my mom will always, if you have her phone number, just email or text her. She'll always want to hear which quotes you like best. But yeah, just having it clear in your mind which parts strike you so much, and then getting to share those with other people. I think that's a really good way of seeing, because also then they ask you, oh, why did you like that line? And then it forces you to say, oh, why did I like that line? And then it forces you to do the stock taking.
It's really interesting that trends change in the classroom over the years. And right now there's a trend in my 8th grade class, that kind of varied fancy script that they print a lot of signs and stuff in. They're obsessed with that script kind of format. And so what they've been doing all year, several of them, is taking their favorite quotes from the books we read and making them into those fancy script. Now, sometimes the quote will be something really horrible and it'll be in this beautiful script and it just seems wrong. But I did have the thought the other day when they brought me another one, oh, wow, these are really going to be imprinted on their minds because they took the time to turn this into this work of art.
We can't, I can't do that with Les Mis, because if I marked out all the lines that I love, that would be a small book by itself. There are just too many fantastic lines. Yeah.
I've been preparing my chapter a day for Middlemarch, and the opening chapter, the prelude, is 2 pages long. And when I was reading the prelude, I always write a lot in my books, underline and write things in the margin. And I started underlining at about the 3rd sentence, and then I underlined every line for the rest of 2 pages, which is completely useless. But there are works of literature where you have to be highly selective to draw out your favorites, but that's when you know you've really gotten to a good book.
Mhm, mhm.
I felt that way with the Aurora Lee. I was starting to read it, book 1, and just wanted to keep underlining. So
What book how far are you?
I'm only a little ways into book 1, just dipping my
2
toe
is-
in,
book 1 is
but
good.
I
Book
like
2
it too. I like what you were saying about it. And it did remind me of Jane Eyre. Definitely. It has some of the same situations.
Okay.
Can I squeeze in a question? I know we're at the end of our time. Real quick, is that this morning I told myself, why can I not read poetry for 2 hours? I mean, I have a lot to do, but I will do it later. Life's not fair. And so I did proceed to read poetry for 2 hours. But one of the things I found was that a lot of times, like, I didn't understand what the lines mean, despite rereading them 3 times. Then I went on Amazon and I tried to see if I can buy some kind of like annotated editions of these books or commentary. And I was surprisingly unsuccessful. And I don't know how other people deal with this problem. And the same with Bloom, Bloom makes all this commentary, but you read the commentary, it doesn't help you to understand the poem.
No, you can do it poem by poem, though. So if I'm really struggling to understand a poem, I'll just search the title of the poem and analysis. Now you're going to get terrible analysis when you do that. But if you read enough analysis, even some of the bad ones, they'll still illuminate things about it that will help your understanding. So you can, for every well-known poem, there are now countless attempts at analysis online. So that's what I would suggest doing. And I would recommend spending a lot of time with one poem as opposed to trying to read a bunch.
Yeah.
I also, I mean, a lot of that is just not knowing some facts, not being well read. So a lot of the poems are alluding all the time to other things that most people would have read. So the notes can help you by just saying, this is a story, this is a myth, this is, and kind of filling you in on some of the details. That's not controversial analysis. It's just kind of, and then sometimes like, what is a plant? What kind of a plant are they talking about? Things like that. You should be able to find that online for most of the most individual poems, like Lisa's saying.
Yeah, I listened, Lisa, to your commentary about RISPA this morning, and that was like very helpful. And I wish that that something like that was available for a lot more poems.
Right.
That really helped a lot. Yeah.
He's hinting to you.
And well, it's on my list, and it's on Joseph's for me.
I think it's clear what everyone's saying, Lisa. You just have to go through the entire list of Bennett and annotate the whole thing.
Okay, that sounds like a challenge. Well, this was really wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this book with me. I have no idea what will be up next. Maybe it's Aurora Lee. I have to go and, try to corral people.
Maybe Shakespeare. What do you think?
What's that? Oh, Shakespeare. I know. That is definitely at the top of my list too. So I will be in touch and let you know what's next on the agenda, but there will be something good, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a great experience.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.